In our next section, we are going to talk about private VLANs. Private VLAN, also known as port isolation, is a technique in computer networking where a VLAN contains switch ports that are restricted such that they can only communicate with a given uplink. The restricted ports are called private ports. Each private VLAN typically contains many private ports and a single uplink. The uplink will typically be a port connected to a router, firewall, server, provider network, or similar central resource. And let's talk about the private VLAN concepts. Private VLAN divides a VLAN into sub-VLANs. The divided VLAN is known as primary VLAN, and sub-VLANs are as known as also a secondary VLAN. A regular VLAN is a single broadcast domain, as you know, while private VLAN partitions one broadcast domain into multiple smaller broadcast domains. Primary VLAN is simply the original VLAN, guys. This type of VLAN is used to forward frames downstream to all secondary VLANs. And let's talk about the secondary VLAN now. And secondary VLAN is configured with one of the following types. The first type is isolated. Any switch ports associated with an isolated VLAN can reach the primary VLAN, but not any other secondary VLAN. In addition, hosts associated with the same isolated VLAN cannot reach each other. There can be multiple isolated VLANs in one private VLAN domain, and the ports remain isolated from each other within each VLAN. And the second is the community. Any switch ports associated with a common community VLAN can communicate with each other and with the primary VLAN, but not with any other secondary VLAN. There can be multiple distinct community VLANs within one private VLAN domain, and there are mainly two types of ports in a private VLAN. The first type is the promiscuous port. The promiscuous port is a switch port that connects to a router, firewall, or other communication gateway device. This port can communicate with anything else connected to the primary and any secondary VLAN. In other words, it's a type of port that is allowed to send and receive frames from any other port on the VLAN. And the second type of the port is host ports, and these are the host ports. And the first type of the host ports is isolated port. An isolated port connects to the regular host that resides on isolated VLAN. This port communicates only with P ports. The community port connects to the regular host that resides on community VLAN. This port communicates with P ports, which is promiscuous, and ports on the same community VLAN. And here is how we can configure the private VLAN, and the configuration is pretty straightforward, as you can see. The first thing we should do is change the VTP mode to transparent. Please keep in mind that if you want to use private VLAN, you need to use the transparent VTP mode. Then we are creating the VLANs. As you can see that we created the VLAN 101, and we created the private VLAN isolated, and VLAN 100 is the private VLAN primary. The primary VLAN is this, and the isolated VLAN is this. And then we are defining a private VLAN association between 101 and 100 by using the private VLAN association 101 command. Then we are defining the promiscuous port. As you can see that we are going under interface mode, interface fastener 01 for example, and we are using switch port mode, private VLAN, and promiscuous command. The promiscuous port is a port that's connected to the gateway such as router and etc., as you know. Then we are using the switch port private VLAN mapping 100 and 101, and we are mapping the switch port by using the private VLAN with the VLAN 100 and 101. The last step is we're going to the interface fast Ethernet 03 for example, and that's this port, and we are using switch port mode private VLAN host command to define that here is a host port, and we are using switch port private VLAN host association with 100 and 101. Then we are going to the fastener 05, and we are defining here as a host port also, and we are using switch port private VLAN host association and 100 and 101. And these commands are showing me that if I'm using a community or if I'm using an isolated port.